The sharp click of expensive heels on concrete echoed across the marina dock before I even looked up from the water level gauge. "Shut it down," Patricia Holloway said. "Every inch of it." Behind her, two HOA board members stood with clipboards tucked under their arms while a security contractor adjusted his radio. Static crackled across the quiet shoreline. The floating festival stage bobbed gently in the lake, strings of decorative lights swaying in the afternoon breeze. The smell of fresh lumber, lake water, and diesel exhaust from a nearby work barge drifted through the air. Patricia pointed directly at a section of retaining wall on my property. "This structure violates community development plans. You'll remove it by Friday." I set my wrench down slowly and looked at her. No. That single word seemed to surprise her more than if I had started arguing. Gravel crunched beneath her shoes as she stepped closer. "Mr. Whitaker, perhaps you don't understand how this community works." I did, better than she ever would. But I didn't say that. The security guard glanced at my truck parked beside the maintenance shed. It was a faded 15-year-old Ford with rust around the wheel wells and a toolbox strapped across the bed. My work boots were covered in dried mud. My shirt carried stains from hydraulic fluid and lake sediment. Patricia followed his gaze and smiled the way people do when they've already decided exactly who you are. "The board has approved a major lakefront enhancement project," she continued. "Everyone is expected to cooperate." The word everyone hung in the air. Around us, workers unloaded materials for the HOA's upcoming summer lake festival. Forklifts beeped in reverse. Dock planks rattled. Metal chains clinked against steel pilings. Hundreds of homeowners were expected to attend in less than 2 weeks. Patricia had been bragging about it for months. According to every newsletter she sent, it would be the largest event in Cedar Ridge Lake's history. "You're blocking progress," she said, "and you're creating liability issues for the association." I glanced toward the shoreline where orange survey flags had appeared 3 days earlier without my permission. Fresh tire tracks crossed ground that belonged to me. Somebody had already started moving equipment through an easement they apparently assumed existed. "You don't have authorization," Patricia added. We checked. That caught my attention, not because she was right, because she sounded absolutely certain. One of the board members opened a folder and produced several documents. Pages fluttered in the wind. Official HOA letterhead, community maps, development plans, procedures, verification reports. All the paperwork people use when they want authority to look unquestionable. Patricia folded her arms. "If necessary, we'll pursue enforcement." The hinges of a nearby gate squealed as another utility vehicle rolled onto the property. Workers continued building. Nobody asked permission. Nobody slowed down. It was obvious they believed they already owned the outcome. I looked beyond them toward the lake itself. Sunlight reflected across the water in long, shimmering bands. The entire community revolved around that lake. Property values, recreation, festivals. Every postcard image Cedar Ridge advertised started with that water. Patricia followed my gaze and smiled again. "This lake belongs to the community, Mr. Whitaker." I nodded once. "Does it?" For the first time, her expression shifted. Only slightly, barely noticeable. But one of the survey markers near the shoreline wasn't where it should have been. And the old county boundary monument half hidden beneath a cluster of reeds suggested something Patricia Holloway and her entire board might have overlooked years ago. The truth was that Patricia Holloway had looked at me for less than 30 seconds and decided she already knew my entire story. People like her usually did. They saw the old Ford pickup. They saw the faded work shirts. They saw a man spending his mornings checking gauges, repairing docks, and carrying tools instead of attending HOA committee lunches. In their minds, that meant they had me figured out. The next morning, the soft hum of boat lifts echoed across the lake as sunlight bounced off the water and painted moving reflections across my workshop walls. The place wasn't much to look at from the outside. Weathered siding, a gravel parking area, an aging aluminum fishing boat resting on a trailer. But inside sat 40 years of records, survey maps, engineering drawings, water flow reports, maintenance logs. Every shelf told part of a story Patricia had never bothered to ask about. I unlocked a steel filing cabinet with a brass key that had belonged to my father. The metal lock clicked open with a sound I had heard thousands of times. My father had kept that same cabinet in a small office overlooking this lake long before Cedar Ridge existed. Back when the shoreline wasn't lined with luxury homes and HOA newsletters. Back when it was mostly timber, farmland, and a reservoir project that our family helped build. A framed photograph sat above the cabinet. My grandfather standing beside excavation equipment in 1958. My father beside him as a teenager. Both covered in dust and smiling at something outside the frame. Most people in Cedar Ridge assumed the lake had always been there. They never asked who designed the system that fed it. They never wondered who maintained the infrastructure before the developers arrived. Patricia certainly hadn't. Her board members only saw property values and recreational amenities. They saw a lake. They never looked beneath it. Wind rattled the dock cleats outside while I flipped through an old leather notebook filled with handwritten entries. Dates, measurements, water levels, easement references. My father's notes filled page after page in neat block letters. Some entries were older than Patricia's entire HOA. Across town, Patricia was probably planning another festival meeting. Probably discussing food vendors, parking permits, and fireworks permits. She believed she controlled the most important asset in the community. The irony was almost funny. The homeowners thought the lake existed because the HOA maintained it. The HOA thought the lake existed because nature provided it. Only a handful of people knew neither assumption was true. Around noon, I drove to the county records office. The old truck engine rumbled steadily as tires crackled over pavement. Inside, fluorescent lights buzzed softly above rows of archived documents. A clerk who had known my family for years greeted me by name and pulled a storage box from the records vault. Inside sat decades-old filings, property transfers, and engineering agreements. Near the bottom was the document I remembered, the original water management agreement. Still active, still recorded, still enforceable. Back at the lake, workers continued preparing for the festival. Forklifts moved supplies. Hammers echoed across floating platforms. Patricia's crew never noticed me standing near the shoreline reading a certified copy of a document that was older than most of the houses surrounding the reservoir. They didn't notice the small notation identifying a privately controlled water source. They didn't notice the legal description attached to land my family had owned for generations. And they definitely didn't notice that the survey marker Patricia's team had dismissed the day before sat directly beside the boundary referenced in that agreement. The first real clue was already sitting in plain sight. The problem for Patricia was that she still believed ownership ended where the shoreline began. 3 days later, Patricia arrived with more confidence than caution. The low electric whine of a security cart drifted across the marina parking lot as she stepped out carrying a binder thick enough to stop a door. 2 board members followed behind her while contractors moved lumber across the floating docks. Nail guns popped in the distance. Water slapped gently against pilings. The entire shoreline felt busy, organized, and expensive. Patricia clearly enjoyed that. She stopped beside a temporary construction trailer and pointed toward a section of shoreline that crossed my property boundary. The board approved additional access for equipment. I looked at the path. Fresh tire marks cut across the gravel. Approved by who? I asked. Then I waited. Silence has a way of making people explain more than they intended. Patricia smiled. The HOA. Another pause. Wind rattled a loose metal sign hanging near the dock entrance. Do you own this property? I asked. More silence. One of the contractors shifted his weight. Another glance toward Patricia. She answered anyway. The community has authority to maintain lake operations. I nodded slightly. That's not what I asked. The security contractor looked uncomfortable now. His radio crackled with static. Patricia opened her binder and produced several pages. Meeting minutes. Project authorizations. Vendor agreements. Everything looked official. Everything usually worked. The problem was that official and correct are not always the same thing. I pointed toward a camera mounted above the marina gate. How long has that been recording? Another pause. Patricia frowned. What does that have to do with anything? Just asking. The gate motor hummed as a landscaping truck entered the property. A keypad beeped. The barrier arm lifted. Then it lowered again. Every vehicle, every entry, every access code, logged automatically. Patricia didn't seem interested in that detail. I was. Cameras had been watching that shoreline 24 hours a day for years. Gate systems never forgot. People did. The following afternoon, I stopped by the security office. The room smelled faintly of coffee and printer toner. Computer fans hummed beneath a row of monitors showing live feeds from around the community. A young security supervisor named Ryan pulled up the access records after I requested copies relating to construction traffic. He wasn't taking sides. He was simply following procedure. The first report showed contractor entries beginning nearly 2 weeks before the board claimed final approval had occurred. The second report showed repeated access through a restricted maintenance gate. Then came something more interesting. Every contractor authorization listed a single approval source. Patricia Holloway. Not the board. Not the management company. Patricia. Ryan leaned back in his chair. That's unusual. I didn't answer immediately. I just looked at the screen. Silence again. Let the facts do the talking. Camera timestamps matched the gate logs perfectly. Vehicles. Equipment. Delivery schedules. Every movement documented. Every claim traceable. By the end of the week, word had started spreading among a few residents helping organize the festival. Nobody was accusing Patricia of anything yet, but questions were appearing. Quiet questions. The kind that make powerful people nervous. One volunteer looked at a printed access report and frowned. Wait, she said. I thought the board approved all this later. Nobody answered her right away. The sound of waves tapping against the dock filled the silence. For the first time, someone who wasn't me had started wondering whether Patricia's version of events matched the records. At first, most people treated it like another neighborhood disagreement. HOA President versus stubborn property owner. That was the story floating around Cedar Ridge. The sound of golf carts moving between houses, delivery trucks passing through the front gate, and construction crews working along the shoreline continued as if nothing unusual was happening. But then the records started multiplying. 3 days after the access log surfaced, my phone buzzed while I was replacing a damaged dock cleat near the marina. The vibration echoed across the metal toolbox beside me. The caller was Melissa Crane, a county clerk I had known for years. She rarely called without a reason. Grant, she said, someone requested archived property records connected to the reservoir system. I looked across the lake where workers were hanging festival banners from temporary poles. Who? A brief pause. Papers shuffled on her end. The HOA's attorney. That got my attention. Not because they were looking, because they had started looking after I asked questions. The lake breeze pushed small waves against the shoreline as I thanked her and ended the call. 2 hours later, I found myself sitting across from Richard Boone, a retired land surveyor who had spent nearly 30 years mapping parcels throughout the county. The old survey office smelled like paper, dust, and printer ink. Ceiling fans rotated slowly overhead. Richard unfolded a set of oversized maps across a conference table. The paper crackled as he smoothed the corners flat. You know what bothers me? He said. He tapped a section near the reservoir boundary. These newer HOA maps don't match the original survey set. I leaned forward. How far off? Richard adjusted his glasses. Far enough that somebody should have noticed. Outside the office window, a delivery truck backed into a loading zone. Reverse alarms beeped. Inside, Richard pulled another document from a filing cabinet. Then another. Then another. Each one told a slightly different version of the same property story. The more we compared them, the less sense the HOA's position seemed to make. By the following week, the questions had expanded beyond Patricia. Now residents were asking about board approvals. Contractors were asking about authorization chains. The management company was reviewing archived files. What started as a disagreement between one homeowner and the HOA had quietly grown into something larger. That afternoon, another unexpected person stepped forward. Ryan, the security supervisor, arrived at the marina carrying a folder. Gravel crunched beneath his boots as he walked toward me. He looked uncomfortable. You should probably see this, he said. Inside were copies of internal security reports, vehicle entries, contractor requests, authorization emails. One particular report stood out. A contractor had requested verification before crossing restricted property. The response approving access had come directly from Patricia's office. Not from the board. Not from management. Patricia. Again. Ryan shook his head. I thought all this had already been reviewed by legal. I didn't answer immediately. Across the lake, music testing for the festival drifted through loudspeakers. Workers moved equipment onto floating platforms. Residents walked the shoreline unaware of what was unfolding behind the scenes. More records appeared. More names surfaced. More timelines stopped matching. And for the first time, Even people who had supported Patricia were beginning to realize this wasn't just about a lake, a property line, or one homeowner refusing to cooperate. Something much bigger was hiding underneath the paperwork. The breakthrough arrived on a Tuesday afternoon with the sound of paper sliding across a conference table. Richard Boone had called me back to his office after finding something buried inside a stack of archived survey revisions. Outside, rain tapped softly against the windows while traffic hissed across wet pavement. Inside, fluorescent lights reflected off dozens of maps spread across the room. Some were original county surveys. Others were HOA development plans created years later. At first glance, they looked nearly identical. Then Richard placed two versions side by side. "Look here," he said. His finger moved toward a narrow strip of land running along the northern edge of the reservoir. The difference was only a few inches on paper, but in the real world it stretched hundreds of feet. I studied the lines without speaking. Silence again. Let the documents tell the story. Richard opened another folder. Then another. More pages appeared. Easement agreements. Utility access records. Development amendments. Every new document seemed to create a larger problem. The rain intensified outside. Water rolled down the glass in long streaks while the old building settled with soft creaks. What had started as a disagreement about construction damage was turning into something far more serious. For years, the HOA had operated under a simple assumption. The roads belonged to them. The marina access belonged to them. The shoreline facilities belonged to them. The lake belonged to them. Every rule, every enforcement action, every approval flowed from that belief. But now the paperwork was showing a different picture. One section of the marina entrance crossed a private parcel. Part of the maintenance turnaround sat inside an easement with restrictions nobody on the current board seemed to understand. The access route contractors had been using during the festival project depended on permissions that were never transferred into HOA ownership. Richard flipped another map around. The paper crackled loudly in the quiet room. "See this?" he asked. I nodded. The same gate Patricia used as proof of HOA authority appeared highlighted in yellow. The same gate. The same security system. The same access controls. The same records. Everything she had relied on to demonstrate power now documented activity occurring across land the HOA did not fully control. Echoes of every earlier argument started connecting together. The gate logs. The security reports. The contractor authorizations. The surveys. Each piece reinforced the others. The system Patricia trusted most had preserved evidence against her position. Later that evening, I sat inside my workshop as wind pushed waves against the dock outside. My laptop screen illuminated stacks of old records while the marina lights shimmered across the dark water. One email notification appeared, then another, then a third. Residents were asking questions. Former board members were requesting documents. Someone had begun comparing archived HOA maps against county records. The circle was widening. I opened the final attachment Richard had sent. A scanned county plat map filled the screen. Bright red markings highlighted ownership boundaries, utility corridors, and water source parcels. My eyes stopped on a section near the reservoir's feeder system. For several seconds, I simply stared at it. Because if the plat map was accurate, and every supporting record suggested it was, then nearly everything Patricia believed about control of that lake rested on a mistake that had existed for years. And sitting in the center of the screen was one document capable of changing the entire story. The document that changed everything was not hidden in some forgotten vault or buried beneath decades of legal confusion. It had been sitting in county records the entire time. The next morning, I met with attorney Daniel Mercer in a conference room overlooking the courthouse square. The steady hum of traffic filtered through the windows, while fluorescent lights reflected across polished wood surfaces. A thick binder sat in front of him. Tabs divided the contents into sections. Surveys, recorded agreements, deeds, easements, county filings. Nothing dramatic, just paper. Daniel opened the binder and turned directly to a recorded agreement dated June 14, 1982. The paper had been scanned years ago, but the signatures remained clear. My grandfather's signature appeared at the bottom. Beside it sat the signature of the original reservoir developer. Daniel slid the page across the table. Read paragraph 7. I did. Outside, a delivery truck released its air brakes with a sharp hiss. Inside, the room suddenly felt very quiet. Paragraph 7 established perpetual ownership of the feeder spring system supplying the reservoir. The developer received lake rights. My family retained water source rights. Separate assets. Separate ownership. Separate legal control. Daniel opened another section. This time, it was a county parcel map certified in 1989 and updated in 2007. Bright boundary lines crossed the page. The reservoir itself appeared in blue. The feeder system appeared in green. Different parcels. Different ownership records. Different tax accounts. Every assumption Patricia had been operating under depended on those two things being the same property. They were not. Daniel flipped to a third document. An expired easement agreement signed in 1994. The original developer had been granted temporary maintenance access to portions of family-owned infrastructure. The easement expired after 20 years. No renewal. No replacement filing. No extension. Nothing. Daniel tapped the expiration date with a pen. This is where their problem starts. He wasn't wrong. The next document made it worse. A county filing from 2015 showed the HOA formally acquiring ownership of the lake parcel from the developer. Patricia had proudly referenced that acquisition for years. It appeared in newsletters, annual meetings, HOA presentations. The board treated it as proof they controlled the entire system. But the filing only transferred ownership of the reservoir parcel itself, not the feeder system, not the water source infrastructure, not the spring parcels. The distinction sat in black ink less than 2 pages into the filing. Nobody had noticed. Or if someone had, they never told the board. Daniel leaned back. They own the bowl. He paused. You own the faucet. The image stayed with me. Later that afternoon, I reviewed insurance records tied to the feeder infrastructure. Every policy renewal for more than 20 years listed the same ownership entity. My family's trust. Not the HOA. Not the developer. Not the management company. The trust remained active. The infrastructure remained privately insured. The ownership trail never broke. By evening, copies of the documents sat organized across my workshop table. The old brass desk lamp illuminated signatures, seals, survey stamps, and parcel numbers. The evidence no longer pointed in different directions. It pointed to one conclusion. For years, Patricia's authority had depended on controlling the story. Now the story belonged to the documents. And for the first time since this started, the HOA no longer held the stronger legal position. The emergency board meeting filled the community clubhouse beyond capacity. Folding chairs scraped across the floor. The air conditioning system hummed overhead. Papers rustled. Quiet conversations stopped whenever another resident walked through the door, carrying a copy of the documents that had begun circulating throughout Cedar Ridge. 2 weeks earlier, Patricia had controlled every conversation in that room. Now people were comparing parcel maps and attorney letters before the meeting even started. At the front of the room, a projection screen glowed blue while board members shuffled through binders that seemed much thicker than usual. Patricia sat in the center seat, as always, but the room felt different. The confidence that normally surrounded her had been replaced by tension. An attorney from the HOA management company sat beside her reviewing a stack of records. Every few minutes his phone vibrated against the table. Every time he checked the screen, his expression grew more serious. The meeting began with routine agenda items, but nobody cared about landscaping updates or pool maintenance. The questions started immediately. A resident in the second row stood holding a copy of the county parcel map. Does the HOA actually own the feeder system? Silence. The projector fan whirred softly. Patricia cleared her throat. The board is reviewing historical records. That answer would have worked a month ago. Not now. Another resident raised an attorney letter that had arrived earlier that day. The letter warned the board that unresolved ownership disputes could affect future infrastructure decisions. Someone else asked about liability exposure. Another homeowner asked whether insurance coverage extended to property the HOA did not own. The room shifted. People who had supported Patricia for years were no longer discussing authority. They were discussing risk, legal fees, insurance coverage, property values, exposure. The money conversation had begun. A retired accountant sitting near the back asked what would happen if years of maintenance expenditures had been made on assets outside HOA ownership. The room fell quiet. Even residents who barely followed community politics understood that question. Across the front table, one board member who had always voted with Patricia started reviewing papers more carefully. Another whispered something to the HOA attorney. The attorney leaned forward and spoke quietly into Patricia's ear. Her expression tightened. The projector screen changed. A scanned copy of the 1982 recorded agreement appeared for everyone to see. Signatures, county recording numbers, legal descriptions. The visual impact was immediate. Nobody needed a law degree to understand what they were looking at. Residents who had trusted summaries were now reading original documents. The attorney requested a brief recess. Chairs moved. Conversations erupted. The sound of dozens of worried voices filled the clubhouse. Outside, golf carts rolled past under the marina lights while workers continued final preparations for the festival. Inside, the board was losing control of the narrative. By the time the meeting resumed, another document had surfaced. An internal review memo prepared for the HOA attorney. Copies circulated from hand to hand. The memo did not accuse anyone of wrongdoing. It simply acknowledged unresolved ownership questions and recommended further investigation before major decisions involving lake infrastructure continued. That single recommendation changed everything. For years, Patricia's authority came from certainty. Now uncertainty sat in the middle of the room where everyone could see it. And as residents filed out beneath the glow of the projector screen, many of them realized the system they thought was untouchable might not actually belong to the people running it. The correction letter arrived on a Thursday morning. The sound of an email notification echoed from phones all across Cedar Ridge before most residents had finished breakfast. By noon, printed copies sat on kitchen counters, clubhouse tables, and marina bulletin boards. The letter was short, formal, and impossible to misunderstand. Following legal review of historical county records, recorded agreements, parcel documentation, and ownership filings, the HOA acknowledged that certain infrastructure rights associated with the reservoir system were not owned by the association. No dramatic language. No excuses. Just facts. Outside the clubhouse, maintenance crews were already replacing temporary signs. The old notices referring to HOA-controlled water infrastructure disappeared one by one. New signs appeared in their place. Wind rattled the fresh aluminum panels as workers tightened bolts and stepped aside. The changes were subtle, but everyone noticed them. At the next board meeting, the projector screen displayed a revised governance policy. The air conditioner hummed overhead while residents filled nearly every chair in the room. Pages flipped. Pens clicked. Nobody was discussing landscaping violations anymore. The conversation had moved somewhere else entirely. A revised procedure required independent legal review before any future project involving shoreline access, feeder infrastructure, utility corridors, or historical easements could be approved. Another policy suspended unilateral authorization authority previously exercised through the board president's office. Every approval now required documented review and recorded verification. The room remained unusually quiet as those changes were read aloud. The same administrative system once used to enforce compliance had become the mechanism correcting its own mistakes. Then came the attorney's statement. The HOA's legal counsel stood and formally acknowledged that several assumptions relied upon by previous boards were unsupported by the recorded property documents. Nobody argued. Nobody interrupted. The projector fan whirred softly as scanned records remained displayed behind him. Parcel maps, county filing numbers, survey references. The evidence had become part of the public record. By the following week, another announcement appeared. Negotiations would begin regarding future access rights, maintenance responsibilities, and infrastructure coordination. The word negotiation mattered. For years, the HOA acted as though permission was unnecessary. Now permission had become part of the process. Money started moving in different directions too. A reserve fund review was launched. Outside consultants were retained. Insurance carriers requested updated documentation. Financial exposure assessments replaced expansion plans. Residents who once worried about enforcement notices were now reading legal updates and infrastructure reports. The priorities of the community had completely shifted. One afternoon, I watched workers remove a laminated policy board from the marina office wall. The old version listed authority assumptions that no longer existed. A replacement arrived 2 days later reflecting the revised procedures. The visual difference was striking. New language, new requirements, new limitations. The system was correcting itself one document at a time. As for Patricia, she remained on the board during the review process. but the center of decision-making had moved elsewhere. Attorneys, consultants, committees, records, procedures. Every mechanism now operated through documented verification rather than personal certainty. The same record system she once relied on to assert authority had become the foundation for limiting it. By the end of the month, official statements, revised policies, correction notices, and legal acknowledgments had reshaped the entire conversation. And for the first time since this began, Patricia no longer controlled the narrative, the process, or the outcome. 2 months later, the lake was still there. The marina was still busy. The dock still rose and fell gently with the water. On most mornings, if you didn't know the history, you would never guess the community had gone through one of the largest governance corrections in its existence. The difference wasn't in what disappeared. The difference was in what remained. Early one Saturday, I drove my old Ford down the same gravel access road where Patricia had once stood telling me what I could and couldn't do. The tires crunched over the familiar surface. The morning sun reflected across the reservoir in long ribbons of gold. A light breeze pushed ripples toward the shoreline. Somewhere across the water, a boat lift motor hummed quietly before shutting off again. The place felt exactly like it had before the conflict started. Only now the records matched reality. Near the marina entrance, a new information board stood beside the gate. The old language was gone. Updated procedures had replaced assumptions. Infrastructure responsibilities were clearly defined. Ownership boundaries were documented. Access requirements were listed. Every change came from agreements, surveys, filings, and legal review. Nothing flashy, just accuracy. The gate itself opened as a maintenance truck approached. The keypad beeped. The barrier arm lifted. Camera systems tracked every entry exactly as they always had. The same systems once used to project authority now existed for their original purpose, documenting facts. I parked beside the workshop and walked toward the shoreline. The brass key my father carried for decades still hung on the same ring. The workshop still smelled faintly of machine oil, old wood, and lake water. The filing cabinet remained exactly where it had always been. Inside were the documents that never changed. Deeds, agreements, surveys, recorded filings. The truth had been sitting there the entire time. It simply took patience for everyone else to catch up to it. Around noon, I passed the clubhouse. Through the windows, board members reviewed reports under the glow of a projector screen. Procedures, budgets, reviews. No raised voices. No power plays. Just governance. The way it should have been all along. Patricia was still a resident. The community was still functioning. Property values remained strong. The festival eventually happened under revised agreements and documented approvals. Life moved forward because the goal had never been to destroy anything. The goal was to correct what was wrong. As the afternoon faded into evening, I found myself standing on the same dock where much of this began. Water tapped softly against the pilings below. The marina lights reflected across the surface. Behind me, cameras quietly recorded. Ahead of me, the reservoir stretched toward the distant tree line. Everything looked peaceful because everything finally matched the paperwork. That's the thing about real authority. It doesn't come from a title, a board seat, a badge on a shirt, or a loud voice in a meeting. Real authority comes from what deeds recognize, what contracts establish, what records confirm, and what the law supports. The sun slipped lower behind the shoreline as a pair of geese crossed the water. Somewhere near the marina gate, the familiar electronic beep sounded once more, followed by the smooth lift of the barrier arm. Order restored itself the same way it was lost, one document at a time. What would you have done? Have you ever dealt with an HOA like this? Let me know in the comments. The last sound I heard before heading home was the gentle click of the gate closing exactly the way it was supposed to.